All right, everybody. Here we go with unpacking chapter 3. It's a smaller period of time, 1928 to 1969. Forgive me for this being in video format, but that's where we're at with the crazy weather we're having. By the way, I'm not kidding about that email I sent when I said practice your non-snow dance, your anti-snow dance, because like everybody loves a good snow day. Trust me. Um, but we have so much to do, and I don't want to miss. I miss y'all, and I like this is one of my highlights of my term, so I don't like to miss this. Especially this is one of my responsibilities is to give you a historical overview of this topic before we move on. So I'm going to give you my crash course to chapter 3. I've broken it down into I think there's 6 and 7, 8 big sections, and I'm going to give you some key takeaways. Now, these are just my takeaways. There could be sections or quotes or names that you have identified that align with you and your interests, and that's okay. I will also give you a link to all of my notes. I ended up doing about 13 pages of notes. Again, when you are leading your group, when you're leading the whole class in your overview, your job is not necessarily to summarize the chapter like I'm doing here. I'm doing this in this way because this is pretty foundational, but it's to inspire discussion for us. And you don't also have to do as intense a notes as I've done. This is just one of the practices I learned as a undergraduate student, and I perfected as a graduate student and a doctoral student to take notes and process information. This works for me, which is why I share it with you. I put in the time so that you can just have this in your back pocket, even if you don't use it right now. File my notes of the outline, just file it away, and then you may eventually come back to it. If not, when you're writing your comps or your dissertation, you may come back to it at some point in the future. You never know. So just file it away. And what I'm going to try and do here is do highlights of that. So we'll see how this goes. There are quite a few slides, so and I don't know how long this is going to take. We're just going to do our best. All right. Again, if we were together, this would be based on your comments and your discussion questions, and y'all would stop me when I got to a quote and we would talk about it, but this is what we got. So let's start off. The Tanners I'm pretty sure they're a couple. They were a married couple who Pinar likes to quote a lot, and they wrote a couple of synoptic texts. Remember, that's like the overview textbooks, and he likes to quote them a lot. So I love this quote from the beginning. Curriculum history is the collective memory of the field of curriculum. It is a matter of feeling. I like that quote. So here's a bird's eye view of what we're going to talk about. Let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, we had 8. So we're going to literally, walk through this period of time. Quickly look at the 20s and 30s. A focus on the 8-year study in the synoptic text, and then do the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then as we transition through the 60s into the reconceptualization in the 70s. So that's just a bird's eye view of where we're going. Again, there's no need for you to take notes while you're doing this unless this works for you. You may want to look at my handout, the 13-page outline of all of this stuff, and you can see the pieces that I've picked out that are particularly important, I think, for you to take away from this. So if we look at the first section, the tumultuous 1920s and 30s, I didn't put this on these slides, but think about what's happening in the 20s and 30s. There was the Dust Bowl, and then the Great Depression, and then this is the period of time in between World War I and World War II. Just historically, what's going on in the United States at this point. Opens with this one of these quotes is in this first section, and it gives a pretty decent overview of where we're at in the 20s and 30s. Borrowing from scientific management, social efficiency curricularists made task and activity analysis the primary methods of curriculum construction. The Bobbitt is where that comes from, and charters, those two names you're going to see a couple of times. And then, and this is interesting, or maybe interesting for you, the progressive dissent. If you remember, that's where we left off last week. The progressives claimed democracy, social reform, and child-centeredness. So that's where those like groups of people start to overlap and combine together. So big takeaways from this first section. The first is George S. Counts. I bet you not many of us have ever heard of him, but I hopefully you'll see in this section, in this chapter, he was actually kind of important and pretty progressive, relatively considering the time. Remember, we're in the 20s and 30s. I know that this quote is from 1979, but this was actually from his lifetime. Um, he's one of the ones that first turned us on to curriculum as a political text. And I want to read this particularly interesting quote to you. My thesis is that complete impartiality is utterly impossible. The school must shape attitudes, develop tastes, and even impose ideas. Because what is known is too immense to be taught in schools, choices must be made. Whatever choices are made regarding curriculum, teachers, teaching methods, partiality is demonstrated. Now, this could be done and shared and said yesterday in 2019, but this was pretty radical stuff. He's just basically saying you can't, there is no such thing as an unbiased way. There is no such thing as complete impartiality. At any time you have to stop and look at your options and make a choice, it involves a certain amount of politics. George just counts, the reason why he's made it here is because no one knows him. And you should probably have an idea of who this guy is, and by the way, keep in notice that we're still in this period. There are not many women that show up in the field yet. You'll see a couple, but not yet, and that's important. A second takeaway, also foreshadowing what's coming in the next couple weeks, Horace Mann Bond. Quote, Bond's understanding of the profoundly conservative character of American education, particularly in the racial sphere, represents a significant moment in the advancement of curriculum knowledge. Bond's work foreshadowed the establishment in the 1990s of race as a central curriculum discourse. So this is just, again, we're in the 20s and 30s. So the important part that I want you to situate from this is like these historical narratives about curriculum. They have a history that goes back even before the 70s and 80s and 90s, which is when we're going to be looking on. But they go all the way back to the 20s and the 30s. And you may have never heard of Horace Mann Bond, and I think it'd be interesting for you to know his name. He's actually got a really illustrious career. I didn't put that in my notes, but go back and reread that section. He was a baller. He was like a dean. He wrote books and papers, and yeah, he was a pretty big deal. Now, this one's a bit of an odd section, the 8-year study, because in this chapter they've decided to organize it by decades, and this is one that's not devoted to a particular decade. It's devoted to the 8-year study. If you've never heard of the 8-year study, and this is an interesting or intriguing idea to you, you should go do some additional research. I mean, within reason. You've got to be careful about your reading and your time. But it was a big deal. And as you'll see in a moment, one of the reasons why not many people know that much about it anymore is because we had a world war that happened. But it was a pretty big deal, especially in terms of curriculum. So just as an overview of kind of where the 8-year study came into play, quote, elementary schools were already undergoing experimental changes inspired by Dewey and others. This is what we learned from last week. But the secondary schools were constrained by rigid college requirements. And understandable, secondary school officials were reluctant to experiment with curriculum because they were worried about what would happen for their students going into college. I didn't finish the rest of this quote or connect this later on, but nothing happened, of course. But we'll get to that in a moment. So takeaway number one. This dude, Ralph W. Tyler, so dominates our lives today that his methods and work are almost ubiquitous, and we don't even realize that. We may say Taylorism or Tylerism or behaviorism or the scientific efficiency, but this is all wrapped up in this one guy, Ralph Tyler. He was always a proponent, like I've mentioned here, of the scientific study of education. This is the dude who aligns the birth of behavioral objectives. He wrote a book, The Basic Principles of Curriculum Instruction, in 1949, that became like the curriculum text that everyone. It was around for 20, 30 years. Other people wrote other books, but people just didn't turn away from the Tyler book. But what I think is interesting for you to understand is that he was he's not the only evaluation staff, but he was one of the folks that was hired to work on the evaluation staff for the 8-year study. There's lots of big education names that came from this study that people just forget that this is where they all started off and did their work. So just reading this quote here, 10 years later, Tyler would formalize the process, the behavioral objectives, in his famous Basic Principles of Curriculum Instruction, 1949, employed in the 1930s to evaluate the progressive 8-year study, I can't spell progressive apparently, the emphasis upon behavior and objectives would in 30 years' time become taken for granted in the curriculum field. And this all goes back to the 8-year study. That's why it's referenced here. The second takeaway that's interesting about that 8-year study is that it was completely ignored. Why was it ignored? Because we went to war. And everything got turned upside down. So people in education may have heard of the 8-year study. Curriculum folks usually can remember what the 8-year study was all about. But the details of it and the findings of it were just like, nobody cared. Because there was a war. But, quote, the experiment did establish one significant fact, a fact that is now often forgotten, that there is not one fixed pattern for a high school curriculum required for college success. There wasn't. You can go back and look at the list of all the schools that they went to and interviewed and did research on. In particular, I think I remember off the top of my head, there were 6 schools in Pennsylvania. I think 7 after they added one more. It was a friend's school, I believe. But that's one of the reasons why nobody mentions it or references it or remembers it these days, because, yeah, we had a war and other things overshadowed. I don't have too much for the third section on the synoptic text. Remember, synoptic texts are just textbooks or any kind of text that give a big overview, like an encyclopedic overview, kind of like this textbook. Things to take away, I think there's only one takeaway, maybe 2 from this. First is that theoretical eclecticism is established. What that means is, so most people in sciences, hard sciences, you act and you operate and you work within one particular theory, maybe 2. But in curriculum, what happened is that this idea, and if you're obviously in Heather's class, you're looking at other kinds of research methodologies. This also aligns with other fields. Curriculum mapped from other and adopted from other fields this idea of theoretical eclecticism, that maybe you don't need one theory. Maybe you pick this piece from this theory and this piece from this theory and this piece from this theory, and you bring them all together. Or you take 2 theories and you overlap them and see what happens. This also led to, as you see, crisis and transformation. People start using alternative methods to think through problems. That freaks people out. Things change. Quote, the currents of curriculum scholarship moved tumultuously during the 1930s, understandable perhaps for a field with such close ties to popular culture, a culture in social, economic, and political crisis during that decade. Remember what we were saying earlier about the historical significance. And the consequence of this crisis was, quote-unquote, eclecticism. Think of like when someone's like, oh, they're eclectic. Same thing, but now with theories. Oh, I was right. There was only one. So now we switch over and we're going to look at some of the decades. We're going to go to the 40s, we're going to go to the 50s, and the 60s, and the end of the 60s, because they're a bit different. So in the 40s, this theoretical eclecticism was institutionalized in the field with the founding on January 1st, 1946, of the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. A lot of you may know of them, the ASCD, because of their current publications. They do magazines and like short journal articles. That when I was first introduced to them back in graduate school, I thought it was mainly for, this is funny, I thought it was mainly for principals, because I associated it with like the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. It never occurred to me until engaging in curriculum theory and curriculum work that the ASCD was born from theoretical eclecticism and curriculum theory in the mid-40s. So takeaway number 1, this idea of social efficiency is life adjustment. Broadly understood, any of these terms, at least, I mean, if this is something that is of interest to you, of course I'm simplifying this, but you should expand on this and get greater conceptual clarity if you're going to go down this road. But anything with life in the title, like life adjustments, life curriculum, life functionalism, or something like that. It's this idea. It's the idea that we should prep people for life, quote unquote life, and by life they mean jobs. I mean, if you're gonna, we should figure out if people are going to be bakers and teach them how to be bakers. If people are going to be bankers, we teach them how to be bankers. And we should align skills and curriculum so that they can better their life. This ties into social efficiency. Thus, the social efficiency is life adjustment. I've pulled this quote because of what it says, because most people don't remember that this is a thing, that life adjustments is a name of something that existed in the 40s but still lives today when you hear people call for vocationalism. But the movement made two contributions to curriculum reform. One, it extended the concept of curriculum beyond schools subject specifically. That's good. That's quite good, if you think about it, to broaden the idea of curriculum. And it stimulated genuine concern for the dropout rate in the nation's schools. There's a marked difference in dropout rates once. It's not exactly cause and effect, but they're somewhat related. There is no evidence, however, that life adjustment views actually brought any major curriculum changes. The movement did support the addition of guidance counselors and the elimination of very small schools. So take that for what it's worth. Takeaway number 2, we have Tyler show back up again. Evaluation and social efficiency they name in the 40s as being in a transitional period. Again, we referenced earlier Tyler's book, Basic Principles of Curriculum Instruction. And I've pulled these quotes because I want you to have them in your back pocket. It's very easy to bash Tyler right now, especially in current educational discourse and dialogue. These quotes I think are relevant for that purpose, but in an appropriate way of doing scholarship and critique. Tyler's book established a tradition of research and teaching about curriculum that will remain unchallenged for 20 years. That's true. To this point, we still the College of Education, whenever it goes through what's the process where they come in and we get authorized to be teacher education people. We have to like show our objectives and stuff, and all this goes back to Tyler, and no one asks any questions about whether or not this is good. But anyway, the second quote: the administration and managerial origin and motive for this work, for Tyler's work, are significant in understanding its structure and content. It's more about administration and management of learning than it is about true understanding of curriculum and what it is for people to learn. That's interesting. And then my favorite quote of this is: the Tyler procedure is not a teacher's statement of curriculum development, it is a bureaucrat's. In the curriculum world, in the research world, those are fighting words. But if you understand the history of where Tyler comes from in the 8-year study and working in evaluation, that'll make sense. We also, in this chapter, learn a bit more about him. His name's Ralph Winford Tyler. He got his doctorate at Chicago, taught first at UNC Chapel Hill. I mention that just because that's around where I'm from. There was an interesting reference in there that he was kind of influenced by Counts. It's interesting. Seems interesting to me given what we attribute to him. He also worked with others, and others' names popular that you may know in the 8-year study, like Bloom, as in Benjamin Bloom, as in Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom and Tyler worked together on the 8-year study. Ding, 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 if that hasn't connected. And I also put this just to the last point, just to kind of shame myself, that when he returned to Chicago, he was invited to return to Chicago. He became chair of the department at 36. I'm pretty sure I'm 36. I may be 35, but I'm around there, and I'm nowhere near being a chair of a department. So for whatever we want to say about Ralph W. Tyler, somebody saw something in him. So let's turn to the 50s, a decade of criticism, conflict, and reformation. So the first takeaway, and not to be glib or glib, is that Dewey passes away. He dies in 1952. I think it's interesting to reference that, considering how his idea and his aura and his life kind of live on. And there's kind of, when I first saw this, I was like, oh, he died in the 50s? Something told me he had lived a whole lot longer, or he'd either died many, many years before. That's where we start. The second takeaway from the 50s is that the classical curriculum orientation returns, it gains strength. It's almost like it's cyclical because it came up in the 50s. It also comes up again in the 1980s. If you're familiar with Mortimer Adler's Paideia proposal, Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, not Benjamin Bloom, another Bloom Allen, and then E.D. Hirsch's Cultural Literacy. If you go to a Barnes & Noble or a real physical bookstore these days, you can still find E.D. Hirsch's Cultural Literacy books, or What My Second Grader Should Know. All that goes back to E.D. Hirsch's work, and all that returns back to classical curriculum orientation. These, again, What is old is new, what is new is old. Same from last week. The third takeaway is, like we mentioned from earlier, in the 50s, Bloom's taxonomy, the taxonomy of educational objectives. His book comes out. Quote, countless students were required to memorize the taxonomy, and countless teachers were required or encouraged to write objectives within the guidelines of Bloom established. I'll go ahead and tell you right now, to be, I can't think of the verb, authorized, evaluated, whatever it is, for teacher education, we have to make students do Bloom's taxonomy as well. Even though I know, well, we can have another conversation another time, but Bloom's taxonomy is not the end-all be-all of summarizing learning and education. But this is a highlight of and a takeaway from the 50s. This is also the heyday of the synoptic curriculum text. If you think about the 50s, post-World War II, tons of books came out trying to summarize and get a grasp on what curriculum is. This is also the birth of a lot of government-sponsored research, the National Defense Act. This is where the NSF comes into play. Obviously, the NSF comes in when and influences science, mathematics, and foreign language curriculum, and that's about where it stops. But if you were wondering, the 50s is where all this government-sponsored research that gets tied to education and tied to curriculum shows up. And then we jump into the 1960s. Expansion, conflict, and contraction. We're skidding right towards reconceptualization. Excuse me. I start this section with the National Curriculum Reform Movement was joined by other projects funded by Washington, including the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. I want to reiterate and point this out because technically, if you go back and look at George Bush the First's Education Act that he passed, and Clinton's, and George Bush the Second's, and Obama's, they are actually renewals of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Yes, they make their own adjustments and they change it for their priorities for politics, but I just want to point out that like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, all these education acts that we've had for the last 50, 60 years, they have a history. That maybe you didn't realize, but they do go back to the 62, 65. And actually, they go back to even farther than that. It depends on how far you want to go back. Not all the way back to Aristotle, Christina, but you can go back to see like other bills that were nationalized. But in 1965, that's where you get this act. Think about also what's happening around in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, and in the 50s with Brown v. Board of Ed. You can kind of get an idea of why there's a national from the government side input into curriculum. There's a couple of takeaways from the 60s because there's a lot going to come up here. The first is Bruner, Jerome Bruner, who you may or may not have heard of. If you haven't heard of him, you're going to see his name a lot more in this book and in your other work. He wrote a book in the 60s called The Process of Education. It is based on some pretty foundational assumptions that you're already aware of, like disciplinary structure, that like English has its own structure, and English is a subject. Science has its own structure. Math has its own structure. The ironic thing that you can now appreciate is that Bruner's theory echoed Herbartian ideas, like you must know something and then you build new knowledge off of what you already know. Again, that was Herbart's idea. It was just an idea. It was not tested or not scientifically proven. Bruner's book is pretty heavily psychological in its language. Quote, designing curricula in a way that reflects the basic structure of a field of knowledge requires the most fundamental understanding of the field. Now, the reason why you need to know Bruner is because he is semi-influential, but also a decade later, I just think this is interesting, it's like he felt the wind change. He completely does an about-face. So I'm going to now compare what we just said about Bruner to this quote. Quote, we shall kill ourselves as a society and as human beings unless we address our efforts to redressing the deep, deep wounds that we inflict on the poor, the outcast, those who somehow do not fit within our caste system, be they black or dispossessed in any way. I would be quite satisfied to declare, if not a moratorium, then something of a de-emphasis on matters that have to do with the structure of history, the structure of physics, the nature of mathematical consistency, and deal with it, he means the earlier part of his paragraph, in the context of the problems that face us. And that's in 71. So that's 11 years later. He's done a complete, like, 180 on what his original ideas were. I don't know. This is interesting for you to ponder. Structure of the discipline's orientation becomes just pretty much taken for granted. It becomes one of our foundational assumptions. This is not a shock to you, but this gets really solidified in 1960s. It wouldn't be like if we can remember I think this was, I don't remember if I told this story. Remind me, and I'll tell about the kids who recreated a civilization in the form of a city. If we all could go invent our schools, we would all probably start immediately by creating camps. Like there's the English teachers, there's the math teachers, there's the science teachers, because we just assume that there is a structure of disciplines orientation, that that's how the curriculum should be organized. A third takeaway is the idea of overlaying affective taxonomy onto our behavioral objectives. So if you're going to buy into the Tyler and Bloom's taxonomy of objectives that tie to behavior, John Goodlad argues for a taxonomy of the affective domain. This is in large part due to the ascendancy of educational psychology in schools of education, conceptualization of human feeling as an affective domain, which can be expressed behaviorally, and then they develop their own taxonomy arranged by human feeling. You can see this as transformed today when people talk about that we should have objectives for behavior, for motivation, and there's one more. It's a third. There's behavior. It'll come to me. But this is where it gets born in the 60s, thanks to Goodlad. Whether or not you believe this is an okay idea, that's up to you. You have to make your decisions. Takeaway 4. This is where mastery learning is introduced. I think this is interesting because this is the 60s, remember? And a couple years ago, Frederick worked for a learning management system that introduced, I think they called it mastery learning. They called it mastery pathways or something. If you know Canvas, they created this whole software, and then he worked with them on that. And it was interesting because they thought that that they had reinvented the wheel, and mastery learning was invented at least in the 60s, if not before then. But it grew out of this conversation about taxonomies and Bloom's and Tyler. Later, the second quote on there, later this competencies would be attached to the concept of competencies which framed many teacher education programs in the early 1970s. This still is true today, except we don't call them competencies anymore, we call them dispositions. But it is, again, really cute because I sit in these meetings with people who have more power than me who talk about, again, dispositions and objectives like they fell out of the sky yesterday, when if you understand the history, you realize this is just the next wave of a different, but not very, of the same sort of conceptualization with some different language. This is also the time of the birth of instructional design. This is interesting for me as being married to an instructional designer and having a background in educational technology. Gagne, G-A-G-N-E, The Conditions of Learning comes out in the 60s and 65. He also, a decade later, writes The Principles of Instructional Design, which essentially births a new field. We can talk about that more in person. But it's also heavily drawn from Thorndike and Skinner, which, if you remember from your Ed Psych or from earlier in the book, the Pioneer book, we're talking educational psychology par excellence, like objectives, observable behavior. But all of this, notice, is being tied into mastery learning, at least packaged into a new bow called mastery learning. There is an emphasis upon assessment characteristics of behavioristic curriculum emphasis. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct. When I was typing all this, I may have been typing quickly. I want to mention there's a name on here. This was criticized by Robin Barrow, who insisted that learning theory has little to offer education in general. We can talk more about this in person, but Robin Barrow spent his whole life teaching at SFU, where I did my doctorate. I only got to meet him once or twice. He was British. He had one of those great, big, booming British voices. I do think he's brilliant, but he does not suffer fools lightly, and he would attack shoddy arguments that he didn't think had any merit. And you'll see on another slide, maybe two other slides, and some more additional Robin Barrow quotes, which I pulled out because that literally is something he would say. I can hear him saying that in a meeting. I sat next to him once, and whew, he was a little vicious. Let's shift to the, 6th, 7th section. We're almost done. Curriculum theory in the 1960s. The first takeaway, New sorts of questions arise. There's a book that comes out of a conference. You'll notice that that's pretty common in 62 Curriculum Crossroads. In particular, Dwayne Hubner wrote a piece called Politics and Curriculum in that book, and that was also presented at the conference. I reference this because Michael Apple, who some of you may be aware of, who's really influential he's still influential in today. I think he's in, where is he? Wisconsin-Madison or somewhere in the North Midwest. But Michael Apple was Hubner's doctoral student, and it was Hubner who influenced Michael Apple to take the pathway of looking at politics and curriculum. Not many people realize that Hubner did that. You should also know that Hubner and MacDonald were also, in their own ways, teachers of Pinar, which is why both MacDonald and Hubner show up so strongly at the end of this chapter. They also will later in the book, but that's just as a reference. Hubner's attention to curricular language would provide the foundation for understanding curriculum as text and discourse. Hubner, and thanks to Pinar, is the one I was mentioning, I think last week, to say there's no way you can know everything and have read everything. And I am happy and simultaneously ashamed to say that I am not as fluent in Hubner's work, and that's one of the things I'm working on as a scholar right now, is trying to retrace some of the intellectual history of ideas back through Hubner. A second takeaway, humanistic voices start coming into the conversation in the 60s as opposed to behaviorism and the work of the social efficiency and the Tyler and Bloom's and the taxonomy and mastery learning. In particular here you'll see Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Now, that's not to say that we haven't taken those two, that is Maslow as in hierarchy of needs that everyone knows about now. But that's not to say we haven't taken their ideas and tried to make them into more scientific or social efficiency ideas. But this is a second takeaway from this period of time. A third, and I just put this in here because I want you to see these three names connected. Virgil Herrick, Dwayne Hubner, and James, not John, earlier I said John, James MacDonald. Never have I ever heard of Virgil Herrick in my entire life, but apparently, thank you Pinar, he is the one who mentored the two major intellectual parents of the reconceptualization, Hubner and MacDonald. Hubner and MacDonald, who are also teachers of Pinar. I think Hubner was directly one of his teachers. MacDonald may have been tangential, but who knows? Maybe we all need to go back and read more Virgil Herrick if we can find anything else out about him. And how I mentioned earlier that Robin Barrow would show up again. The fourth takeaway as we end this chapter is that there is no real consensus on a curriculum theory. There are lots of curriculum theories, but no one. And I'm going to quote here from Robin Barrow, a view articulated by him 20 years later in 84. Remember, we're talking about the 1960s, but 20 years later he said, "The view that curriculum theory should concern itself with empirically based prescriptions for practice is evidently misplaced, and the idea that curriculum planning should involve instructional prescriptions of a specific kind is to be resisted." Now, if I could do a British accent, I would say that in a British accent, and you would go, and it would sound like some great big truth. But if you really want to follow along with his argument, you need to go read his work. He is a proper philosopher and historian of education, and he's made his case over a lifetime about why the study of education should be something that is separate and not necessarily connected to the lived everyday experience of teachers and students. Whether or not you adhere to that, he's made a compelling case. If you're wondering why on earth would this matter, for example, there are applied sciences like physics and maths that attach directly onto to sciences that impact us every day, like medicine and whatnot. But there's also theoretical physics and people that push Einstein and those people who push the boundaries of what we know. That's what Robin Barrow is talking about here. That there is something there that we may not have to be always focused in this direction. I have decided to focus more in this direction of the classroom, but that's not always the case. And the takeaway number 5, they named the death of the curriculum field as 1969 with Joseph Schwab's, another name you're going to get to know very well, The Practical Language for Curriculum. If you're interested, you should go pull that up and read it. It's interesting. And this is what they call the death of the curriculum field, and the field where it's really in crisis. Which leads us to the conclusion in the initial stages of the reconceptualization. The first takeaway is that humanistic psychology wanes in its influence. Remember, that was Rogers and Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. And that MacDonald, and there's a couple of quotes I'm going to read to you from MacDonald, called for a new image which could shape schools in general and the curriculum in particular. He called those schools which recognize a new image of children as self-actualizing, as reality-centered. He's really setting it up and making a pretty strong argument there. Now he argues for or against the danger of curriculum engineering, and this is a couple of longer quotes I want to read to you because I think they're important, because they give you an understanding of where this is kind of like where the gauntlet got thrown down, relevant to the like where we had to go, at least in Pinar's telling of the story, where we had to the field of curriculum go straight into reconceptualization. So let's look at this quote: "The danger of our present systems approach to human behavior is that we gain greater control over ourselves. The systems concept, as we gain greater control over ourselves, the systems concept will become so useful in solving our problems of efficiency and effectiveness that we shall be in grave danger of losing contact with reality through aesthetic rationality. Further, schooling will be reduced to objectification of this systematic process of efficiency and effectiveness. This process is already demonstrable or demonstratable in other aspects of society." And the interesting thing he notes is that the systems approach, the more it fails, the more its use intensifies. He uses in the past tense. I'm just updating it into the present. He continues in a different work, but this is a third takeaway. And this spans 2 slides, so just hang in there with me, but it's the same general thrust. "Obviously, if education is to escape a similar entrapment as weapons delivery systems lock us into nationalism and an arms race," he's writing in 1967, "theories and curriculum must remain broad enough in scope to include the use of aesthetic rationality. This means specifically that the systems metaphor is not enough and must be used carefully. The central question is whether theory and theorizing are neutral or are they committed. Yet and he means curriculum theories, yet curriculum theory's central utility may well be the creation of forms which lead to interpreting curriculum phenomena, not so much to solving curriculum problems by applying scientific generalizations. At present, the most appropriate role for curriculum theory is probably an interpretive role. Theory in curriculum has an essentially heuristic role. Curriculum theory should be committed, not neutral. It should be committed to human fullness in creation, direction, and use. All of man's, I'm going to change it to humankind, he means everybody. All of humankind's rational potential should be committed to the processes and goals in curriculum theorizing. Curriculum theorizing is an act of disciplined thinking. It is disciplined by the vertical awareness of curriculum theory as it has been developed historically, and by the horizontal awareness of humankind's contemporary status of development in various formal disciplines. Rather than place emphasis only up on the discipline of technical reason, curriculum theory should be disciplined by the total rational potential of man, he means humankind, both aesthetic and technological. The reason why I've included this, number one, is because it's a longer quote, and Pinar doesn't do that unless he thinks it's important. And 2, especially if I go back one slide, this idea of systems and systems theory, I guess it was on the slide before. Yeah, the systems approach. What intrigues me about this quote is if you're in touch with the sustainability movement and conversations happening on Westchester's campus, they adopt a systems approach. And I don't know how deeply they've thought about it, or if how they would respond to something like MacDonald's comments here. It's worrisome when we think about it in these terms. Like he's saying, if we can only see this in terms of a systems approach, we lose something over here that can't be fit within the system. But it's an interesting idea, and it makes me want to go back and read more MacDonald. I mean, this was in the 60s, and until I became a doctoral student of curriculum theory, as you are, I'd never heard of him. I'd never heard of MacDonald. The other guy, and remember I mentioned this is probably going to happen because he's one of Pinar's teachers, is Huebner, and this is another scholar who I'm working on reading more of his early work. You can see there are 2 of his pieces from 63 and 66. His focus was on phenomenology, temporality, And actually, and this is also was news to me until I became a student of curriculum theory, because he influenced Michael Apple, looking at curriculum as a political process and as a political feature. And I'm going to read this last quote from you. It does break over into 2 pages, but what I find it does as a final takeaway, it gives us a good summation of what we've just read as we transition into fully looking at the reconceptualization. So, the decade of the 1960s was dominated by federal funding and disciplinary leadership of a national curriculum reform movement. Bruner and others developed a coherent curricular view based on the disciplines, one based in inquiry and possibly not wholly in dispute with the Deweyan progressive emphasis of 30 years earlier, although this, as we noted, was contested by some scholars. The scientific behavioral wing of the field developed strongly, although, as we have seen, several individuals labored in relative isolation to challenge the taken-for-granted conceptions of curriculum and instruction. MacDonald, Hubner, Kleibert, Eisner, Green, Berman, and Clore opposed behavioralism, scientism, which means a reduction of forms of knowing to quantifiable ones, dehumanizing technology, and an oppressive, alienating bureaucratization of the schools. These curriculums first attached behavioral objectives, then bureaucratization, the discipline-centered orientation, and quantified, standardized evaluation and measurement of learning. This challenge, largely uncoordinated, represented the first stage of the reconceptualization as the traditional field, for a few, became static and limiting. For next week, you got 2 readings. We're moving out of the Joseph text, but you are going to read chapter 4, which is on the reconceptualization, and you're also going to read Egan's article, who was one of my teachers. He was Robin Barrow's colleague at SFU, and then Kieran Egan was one of my teachers. He taught literally half different program. I can tell you more about it if you want, but I was only required to take 4 classes as a doctoral student, a different model of a doctorate. That being said, it took me 5 years to complete my doctorate, so you never know, right? But he taught 2 of my classes, 2 of my 4 that I took. So Egan, I'm pretty partial to him. But you're going to read his article on assumptions and curriculum. Just read that article, be fluent in it, because when we come in together next week, after we talk about the assignment for the literature review, we'll do a brief overview of that. We're going to do an activity on Egan's article, and then we'll turn directly and look at reconceptualization, which will set us up for our first curriculum as a political text, our first lens looking at curriculum. Thank you for hanging in there, watching this. I know it's not the same as all of us being together. Just know I miss you all. I'm happy I'll be here and attached to my computer like I always am. So if you want to chat, if you want to have a phone call, if you want to have a video, FaceTime, whatnot, we can do that too. Just holler or shoot me a text message. Looking forward to reading your papers. Have a good week and stay safe and stay warm.